Fernand Croiso. This is an extraordinary meeting of the Health Board to consider three substantive matters. They are the financial accounts for the 2021-22 year, the end of reporting arrangements in terms of particularly the annual report and the annual governance statement, and also the audit, WOW's audit reports on the financial statements of the same year, i.e. 2021-22. I have apologies recorded that have been noted outside. I'm conscious of the fact that the audit committee have sat this morning to consider the same items. So without further ado, I will ask for the chair of audit committee, Mr. Medwin Hughes, to provide us with a outline of the matters discussed at audit committee earlier on. Thank you, Medwin. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, as you mentioned, we've just been sitting this morning, and at today's meeting, the committee reiterated its dissatisfaction in relation to the scale and scope of the internal control failures in relation to the following: financial statements, which has resulted in substantial delays in the completion of the audit, resulting in the AGM being postponed to the 29th of September 2022. The significant internal control failures highlighted in the Audit Wales report and the associated qualifying true and fair opinion. And finally, the significant issues set out in section 21 of the annual governance statement, noting that some of these have an adverse impact on patient safety. The committee received the final report from Audit Wales this morning, taking into account that we had been monitoring this over a period of some time through a series of meetings held on the 13th of June 2022, the 30th of June, the 13th of July, and most recently the 22nd before today's meeting. On the 22nd of July, the committee received and accepted the CEO's advice not to adjust the material misstates and misstatements of 10.3 million upon balancing the risk on clinical services provision for the population of North Wales, as this amount would move the organisation towards a savings target of 45 million rather than the current 35 million. In accepting this position, the audit committee will maintain oversight of the urgent remedial actions required to improve the internal control environment, and we will be seeking an update in the October meeting. On the 13th of July 2022, the committee agreed to oversee an external review of the financial controls upon the completion of the external Audit Wales review on the 19th of August 2022. As of today, initial terms of reference and scope are currently being agreed with Ernst & Young in collaboration with Audit Wales, taking into account the findings from the audit. These matters have already been escalated via my committee's chair's assurance report to the board on the 4th of August 2022. As part of this escalation, I also highlighted to the board the high number of limited assurance audit opinion reports, as well as the overall limited internal audit opinion that we also touched upon this morning. This is also incorporated within section 21 of the annual governance statement, which forms part of this agenda. We will be going on later on to talk about the financial statements, but the committee did endorse the 2021-2022 financial statements and the 21-22 annual report and AGS, emphasizing again the dissatisfaction around the unacceptable position that we find ourselves in. To this end, the committee will closely monitor the financial controls review and subsequent findings arising from it, noting that significant impact that this will have on the 22-23 financial statement. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Medwin, and thanks for that opening statement and for the consideration by Audit Committee. We will come to, no doubt, during the course of discussions in board, the endorsement of this dissatisfaction you've expressed and also the serious concerns that you've highlighted. Before we come to substantive items, can I just confirm first of all that there are no declarations of interest for anybody in this meeting? Thank you. And secondly, can I welcome Vaughan Roberts, who's the new associate member of the board, and no doubt Vaughan will come to contribute either during this meeting as we move forward as a board. Croiso, Vaughan. So, as I understand it, the audit committee sought to rearrange the agenda this morning. I'm going to do likewise in this board meeting. So what I propose to do is take the audit rounds report first, i.e. the third item, then come to the financial accounts, and finally move to the end of year reporting. So Matthew, would you like to introduce yourself? And then I'll hand over to you, if I may.
Thank you, Chair. For the board members, I'm Matt Edwards. I'm an audit director with Audit Wales, responsibility for the annual audit of your financial statements. Thank you, Chair. So I'll just briefly spend a few minutes just taking you through the report that we presented to the audit committee this morning. And I'm conscious that some of the members on the board don't sit on the audit committee, so I'll probably just spend a little bit more time taking you through some of the key findings contained within that report. And the report that you have before you today sets out the key findings arising from our audit of your annual financial statements to inform your approval process today to enable the Auditor General to certify and lay the accounts with the Senedd on Friday. Whilst the timetable is within the statutory deadline, certification is later than in previous years due to the additional work we've been undertaking in response to issues identified with your financial statements. I would reflect that it's been a particularly challenging audit for the reasons the chair of the audit committee just referred to, and I'll say a little more on those issues shortly. But we are grateful to the Health Board's finance team for their assistance in enabling us to report to you today. I think the first thing that I'd like to share with you is that the auditors can never give complete assurance that the accounts are correctly stated, and instead we apply a level of materiality. And that's the level that we deem or consider that could influence the user of the accounts into being misled. And this year we set that level at just over 20 million. We also apply lower thresholds for areas that are considered more important to the reader of the accounts, such as the remuneration report, related party transactions relating to officers and board members, and also ministerial directions covering clinician pension tax liabilities. In terms of the key messages contained within the report, I draw members' attentions to paragraphs 12 to 17 on page 6 of the report. And once you provide us with a letter of representation that's included within your agenda today, the Auditor General intends issuing a qualified, true and fair opinion, as we've been unable to obtain sufficient appropriate evidence that liabilities and expenditure have been properly accounted for in the correct financial year. Whilst the identified and corrected errors amount to approximately 9.1 million and are not material to financial statements, we're in the unusual position where we've been unable to quantify the true extent of the misstatement, as the Health Board informed us it did not have the capacity to respond to the queries or support us in undertaking additional audit work to enable us to conclude. We've therefore been unable to obtain sufficient appropriate evidence that expenses incurred but not paid in year and liabilities within £73 million within note 18 existed at the year end, or that expenditure amounting to 122 million occurred in the year or was properly accounted for in note 3.3 of the financial statements. Further information on those uncorrected misstatements identified are included within Exhibit 2 of the report on pages 7 to 9, and Exhibit 3 on page 10 also sets out the significant deficiencies in internal controls that the chair of the audit committee just referred to that led to expenditure being reported in the wrong financial year. The Auditor General has also included further information on these concerns within his report to the Senedd in Appendix 3 of the report, which also contains 3 key recommendations. Firstly, that the Health Board undertakes a comprehensive exercise to identify and correct for the errors in its accounting records. Secondly, it identifies the corrections needed to ensure the 22-23 accounts give a true and fair view. And finally, the Health Board undertakes a review to understand why these issues have arisen to enable it to strengthen its controls. And I'll be liaising with Ernst & Young later today to discuss the scope of that with the Board Secretary also. The Auditor General also requests that the Health Board confirms in writing by the 30th September, setting out how it proposes to respond to those recommendations. Moving on, the Auditor General also intends qualifying the regularity opinion. So that's another aspect of the audit opinion that the Auditor General issues, and that considers whether in all material respects expenditure and income have been applied for the purposes intended by the Senedd. Firstly, and in line with previous years, the regularity opinion is qualified as the Health Board did not meet its revenue resource allocation over the last 3 years, as set out in note 2.1 of your financial statements. And secondly, in common with 8 other health bodies, the financial statements contain irregular expenditure of 2.3 million in complying with a ministerial direction to fund clinicians' pension tax liabilities to restore the value of their pension benefits packages. In the Auditor General's view, the expenditure in relation to this is irregular and is material by nature. The key facts surrounding these matters are also included within the Auditor General substantive report, including reference to the fact that the Health Board did not meet its financial duty to have an approved 3-year integrated medium-term plan in the preceding 3 years. And finally, the report also summarises the other key corrections that have arisen as a consequence of our audit, and these are summarised in Appendix 4. And we're satisfied that appropriate amendments have been incorporated within the financial statements that you have before you today in respect of those. So to conclude, Chair, the audit has raised a number of significant issues resulting in both the true and fair and regularity opinions being qualified, and those matters have already been reported to the Audit Committee, as I set out earlier. The Board is asked to note the report and the recommendations contained within the Auditor General's report to the Senedd, and following approval of the financial statements, the Auditor General will certify and lay the accounts with the Senedd this Friday. I'll leave it there, Chair, diolch yn fawr, but will gladly take any questions on any specific aspects of the report. Diolch.
Diolch, Matthew. Medwyn, can I come to you first in case there's anything you wish to add, having received that report from Matthew, please?
Thank you, Matthew. Yeah, just one question, please. Please, can you explain for the benefit of the board and the public, put this into context, explain the context as the basis of the qualified and fair opinion in relation to the fact that the misstatements amount to 9.3 million, whilst the basis includes the 122 million of expenditure and the 72 million. Could you just explain that to us and put that in context, please? Thank you.
Yeah, diolch yn fawr, Medwyn. So in terms of the 9.1 million error, that's the quantified error that we've identified from the work that we undertook, from the audit work that we undertook, and agreed with the Health Board. I think the decision was taken by the finance team in late June, early July, that it could not support any further consideration by the audit team of what any residual errors could be contained within residual populations that we'd not had the opportunity to test at that point. Due to the additional extended testing that we required to undertake when we identify issues with our initial population. So the 9.1 million relates to the actual error we can quantify, and the residual errors, or the residual uncertainty, I should say, so 73 million within note 18 and 122 million within note 3.3 relates to the residual populations that we've been unable to audit because of the decision taken by the finance team.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Thanks.
Thanks, Medwyn. Before I open it up, Joe as the accountable officer, or Sue, or both as Director of Finance, is there anything you want to say before I open it up to the board?
Diolch yn fawr, Chairman, diolch yn fawr, Medwyn as Chair of the Audit Committee. Thank you for the opportunity to respond. We are, on behalf of the executive team and speaking for myself as accountable officer, incredibly sorry for the circumstances that have brought both the Audit Committee and the Health Board to this position with regard to our annual accounts and associated governance statements, which we will discuss later on in this agenda. As accountable officer and executive, on behalf of the executive team, I'd like to provide my assurance to the board, members of the public and partner colleagues that we are and have already put actions in place that will ensure that we are not in this situation for future audits going forward. A range of enhancements to our control environment have already been put in place. A series of organisational management changes are being discussed with the express purpose of improving our oversight around accounts is in hand. And of course, we are intending to and have already agreed to work with our colleagues in internal audit and external audit to ensure that we work through any process improvements or lessons learned and implement any changes accordingly, of course, with the oversight of the audit committee. And whilst we recognise and support the independent review which has been commissioned, any findings that we need to put in place as a consequence of that review, we will also seek to do the same. Thank you very much for the opportunity to offer my apologies to the board. Diolch yn fawr.
Yeah, Sue.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies, I can't get my video to work because I'm just not at a BCU location today. I just wanted to say that the errors in the accounts for 21-22 are unacceptable, and I sincerely apologise for the situation the Health Board is now in, excuse me, because of those errors. We accept the recommendations of the Auditor General in full and will work with all of our stakeholders to ensure that they are completed with urgency and in a comprehensive manner. And I would like to thank Matt and his team and the finance team for their work. It's been quite a stressful situation for all of us to find ourselves in, but Matt and his team have been professional throughout. But we will continue to work in a proactive manner, both with Audit Wales and with internal audit, to make sure that we put the controls in place and we can assure the Health Board, the Audit Committee, PFIG and Audit Wales that we have done that. If I just turn to a couple of the recommendations from the Auditor General's report, in terms of the first one, which was to undertake a comprehensive exercise to identify and correct for errors in the accounting records, we have already undertaken some additional testing as part of that additional work with Audit Wales. And that testing did not indicate any further areas of significant concern. But now that the audit is concluded, we will progress that piece of work at pace with Audit Wales support. In terms of identifying the corrections that we need to make to ensure the 22-23 accounts give a true and fair view, we are already discussing this both with Matt and his team and with Welsh Government, and we will seek to complete that action before we respond to the Auditor General on the 30th of September. And just in terms of the third review, the third recommendation around the undertake the review, that was discussed and agreed by the Audit Committee on the 13th of July and is progressing. So I think we're doing everything we can to provide the assurance that we know that our stakeholders and the Health Board specifically needs before we we get to a position about talking about next year's audit. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue. Right, I'm going to open it up. Any questions or observations from anybody else in the meeting? John.
Thanks, Mark. I have a specific question in terms of one of the recommendations that's come out of this, but I think a general point really to start with would be, I know from a PFIG point of view, we've got an initial paper that is addressing further controls that are going to be put in place, but I would expect that we would continue to monitor those controls, and anything that comes out of the review, we would want to adapt that and continue to monitor that as we go forward through the year. In terms of the specific question, there's reference in the Audit Wales report to a contract for 1.7 million that has not yet been approved. And whilst there's a consequence here in terms of the audit, my question is, well, what other consequences are there with regard to that specifically in terms of financial consequences if we haven't had approval, and patient services, patient care if we haven't had approval, because I'm not quite sure what that contract is for.
Thanks, John. Sue?
Thank you, Chair. John, just in terms of the question around the contract, so that we did request Welsh Government approval, but they queried the contract asking for some additional information. It relates to a platform solution for data around both our unscheduled and planned care activity. We have now completed the response to Welsh Government around the additional information thereafter, but what we need to do is just take that to the board for approval before we then go back to Welsh Government for approval. In terms of impact, it's obviously delaying the work progressing, but it shouldn't have a greater impact than that, provided we move with some urgency now that we have concluded the review and the response to Welsh Government's queries.
On the wider point of financial impact of this qualified opinion and the accounts for 22-23, can you explain that, Sue, too, please?
I'm sorry, Mark, I just missed the first thing that you said.
Well, the discrepancy of around £9.3 million has been identified for this year, hasn't it, as a consequence of expenditure being brought forward in effect from 22-23 into 21-22. As Director of Finance, you just want to describe what action is now required to reconcile that, particularly as we move forward into the accounts for this year. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So effectively, it means that the surplus for 21-22 was understated by that value, and therefore, when we do the correction for 22-23, there will be a equal and opposite impact in terms of a deficit. So over the 2 years, and therefore around our rolling duty, it won't make a difference. My expectation at this stage is that after we've discussed it with Welsh Government, it will be a technical adjustment on the face of the accounts, so we're not going to open the ledger. So it won't affect the overall position around our rolling 3-year duty, the statutory duty. But it will mean that there will be a difference between the 0.3 going to 9.4, and then the same impact on 22-23. I hope I explained that.
You did, yeah. So there has been no financial gain to the board or the organisation?
No, not at all. So the impact, if we had corrected it, there would have been an impact in 22-23 because we would have accrued that expenditure and we wouldn't have had income to match it.
Right, okay, thank you. Anybody else want to ask any questions or clarify any points?
Chair, I think Claire has put a question in the chat.
It's not a question, it's an observation, I think. More, Sue, I'm not sure where it's more appropriate for you or Matthew to respond to that. Can you agree now?
Well, I'm happy to start, and then if Matt wants to comment, obviously, I'm happy for him to do so.
Right, so just do you want to read out the comment from Claire first, so everyone's...
I will, thank you. So Claire has put in the chat, the BCU paper on the accounts implies that Wales Audit Office wanted further work on last year's accounts to stop, whereas their report says we withdrew from the further work due to other pressures, and Claire's uncomfortable with that inconsistency. So if the BCU paper says that the Audit Wales wanted further work to stop, then that is not the implication that you should be taking. There was pressure on all of the teams because obviously we were supposed to conclude the audit and have the audit committee on the 13th of June to approve the accounts, and obviously we are 2 months on from that point. From my perspective, there are a number of pressures. One was that we are obviously part of a greater consolidation. So NHS Wales first consolidate our accounts into theirs, and then NHS Wales accounts are then aggregated into the Welsh Government accounts. And obviously we have had a significant impact on that upward timetable. So I was concerned about that. I was also unsure because of the quantum of the numbers that we were talking about in the residual population, that we would ever get to a point where we'd be able to conclude it without spending another 3 months on it. And obviously from a health board perspective, it is really critical that this year is the focus of the finance team's attention and that we get on with that as quickly as possible. And I guess from Matt's perspective and his team, they had a number of other audits that they had to get on with, just because of the timetable that they have for the annual accounts cycle of business. But they did find additional resources to help, but I think it would have been a strain on them as much as it was on us. So we just came to a position where, in terms of the accuracy of the difference and being able to get that down to a small enough number, that I just didn't think we'd be able to do it within a sort of a 2 month period. I'm sure Matt will comment on that as well. But we did an awful lot of testing, and obviously, you know, the team were tired, and I'm sure that Matt's team were in the same position. So it just seemed the most pragmatic solution, because whatever we did, the accounts were still going to be qualified. I'll leave it there, Chair, and Matt can comment as he sees fit. Thank you.
Matthew.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Sue, for that. Yeah, just to come back on the comment, I echo what Sue said in respect of, you know, the Audit Wales position was we were prepared to continue auditing the accounts so we could quantify and address the level of uncertainty that's identified in the audit report. So we're absolutely committed to that. But for the reasons that Sue set out, the Health Board indicated that it could no longer support the audit, and that's the position we reached. But just to reassure yourselves, despite the impact it did have on the audit team and the finance team that Sue's referred to, we were committed to continue auditing the accounts to enable us to conclude on this matter. Thank you.
Okay, thanks both. So we'll come to the recommendations set out in the Audit Wales report in a moment. But first of all, I just want to say one of the reasons why we find ourselves perhaps in this position is that due deference was not given to the role of Audit Committee in these circumstances, and decisions were being taken by the executive, which arguably they could take, but without the purview of Audit Committee, and that was not the best approach to be adopted in these circumstances. That has been highlighted by Audit Committee, highlighted to the board, and highlighted to the executive team, and I do not expect to see a repeat of that moving forward, because Audit Committee has got a purpose to serve on behalf of this board as a collective, and it needs to serve that purpose and be seen to serve that purpose. Second thing is, as Medwin has highlighted, no matter what, this is a serious matter and has given rise to significant concern within the board and dissatisfaction, which is obviously shared by the Auditor General. And that is why we are commissioning a review to identify what we can learn from what's occurred. And that review will be commissioned to an external party. And as Matthew has already said, with the involvement of Audit Wales in terms of arriving at the scope for the review. Turning to the recommendations, then, can I confirm that the board accepts the three recommendations set out by the Auditor General, and the board accepts that we are to respond by the 30th of September to the Auditor General?
Yes.
Thank you. Secondly, can I confirm that you are content for the letter of representation, which is included in the paper, to be tabled in the fashion that it is, by way of response from the accountable officer and from me as chair of the board?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I think, Molly, unless you tell me otherwise, that then concludes that item on the agenda.
Yes, Chair, that is correct.
Thank you. Right, okay, so I'm going to move us on to then the financial accounts for 21-22. And before I come to Joe as the accountable officer, Medwin, can I ask for your explanation as to what happened in the audit on this particular item, please?
Basically, Chair, we agreed to the financial statements being presented to board as they were, notwithstanding the fact that the audit opinion was what it was. So we are suggesting that the board approves this.
Thank you. Thanks, Medwin. Joe.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to ask Sue to take us through the this financial accounts paper, if that's okay with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. So the papers are very comprehensive. They deal with the annual accounts for 21-22. And if I just summarise where we are, so NHS Finance Act of 2014 has provided two statutory duties for the Health Board to achieve. One is that its expenditure does not exceed the funding that we have received over a rolling 3-year period. And for this set of accounts, that period is from the 1st of April 2019 to the 31st of March 2022. And it relates to both revenue and capital funding that we are in receipt of. And for that duty, we have failed because although we had a small surplus this year and a small surplus in the previous year, the year before we had a deficit. So the position is of a 37.9 million deficit over that 3-year period. We are also under a duty to prepare a plan to secure compliance with that duty and for that plan to be approved by the Minister for Health and Social Services. As the board are aware, in 2021, that duty was paused because of COVID, and therefore we have also failed that duty. The Health Board is also required to comply with the CBI Prompt Payment Code, which asks that we pay 95% of all non-NHS invoices by number within 30 days of receipt of the goods or a valid invoice. And we did achieve that duty. In terms of our financial targets, our revenue resource performance is for a surplus of 0.29 million. That is obviously not taking into account the errors that we have discussed in detail. And the cumulative position is of a 37.9 million deficit. In terms of the capital resource performance, we had a cumulative underspend of 0.1 million against the capital resource allocations across the 3 years. And so we did achieve that target. I think the key points to note are that our revenue resource allocation from Welsh Government was 1.874 billion, which is an increase of 64.5 million on the previous year. And that our miscellaneous income for the year was 156.6 million versus 152.5 million the previous year. Our capital expenditure was 47.6 million against 35.6 million in the previous year. And obviously, I think it's worth ensuring that we note for the record that Audit Wales had identified a number of errors in the accounts in their testing, which was finally concluded at 9.1 million, but that does exclude the residual balance that we've already discussed. The paper is very detailed, so it goes through expenditure, income and the financial position. And I suggest that I leave it there, Chair, but I'm happy to take any questions on the detail within the report.
Any questions or observations for anybody on the board? So are you happy to endorse Audit's proposal that we accept and approve the financial accounts, recognising that mitigations are being put in place and will be required to be put in place in keeping with the last item in the discussion in relation to that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Right, so we will now move on, if we may, to the end of year reporting. Molly, are you taking us to this item, or are we doing the annual report through Joe first?
I'm happy to present both items, Chair.
Okay, over to you then. Thanks, Molly.
Thank you, Chair. So both items are presented for board approval ahead of their submission at the annual general meeting on the 29th of September. Both documents have been subject to an extensive audit process by Audit Wales. They've checked both documents against their compliance with the manual of accounts and found them to be adequate for their requirements. So I won't dwell too much on the annual report. But the annual government statement, as was described by Medwin, is quite critical in light of what we're discussing today. So just to highlight board members' attention to section 21, which is an overview of our significant issues, which have a wide range of matters spanning across clinical, financial and quality, some of which was discussed at this morning's audit committee. So the first point to highlight, Chair, is there is a commitment across the executive team to address these matters, and they'll be the subject of an improvement plan which the audit committee will monitor as part of the process of improving the internal control environment. And where appropriate, relevant aspects will be delegated to respective board committees, in which the scope is determined. The other thing to highlight as well, Chair, is that we have updated the document to highlight the feedback we received from Welsh Government on the 22nd of July in relation to the IMTP not being approved. However, as part of that, we're using the feedback to improve and enhance our submission from this end of the year period. And in closing, Chair, I'll just highlight that I'm due to speak to the Vice Chair about some other feedback that she'll give me, which won't affect the substance of the report, but will enhance this presentation ahead of the AGM. I'll just pause and take any questions.
Joe, do you want to comment on the scale of the issues that are listed in section 21 as highlighted by the Board Secretary and the response?
Thank you, Chair. We have put a revised programme of actions in place to deal with the range of challenges that are outlined in regard to that particular section. We are already making some good progress in ensuring that we will be in a much stronger position with regard to our statements this time next year. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. And as discussed on the back of this annual governance statement and also last board, I'll be setting out some concerns that I'll seek to engage you with as the wider board and seek some assurance around those particular issues. Lucy.
Noted. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Joe. Lucy.
Yes, I think it would be helpful to have those contingencies and additional action being taken very clearly laid out, and so that the board as a whole, as well as our stakeholders, are content that we are taking these matters seriously. The annual governance statement is really quite disappointing given where we find ourselves this last year compared to previous years where we were showing improvement. So this plan needs to be really robust to make sure that we're not going to get in this situation again.
I agree, and in keeping with what I've just said, I will be seeking that assurance from Joe, the Chief Executive. Thanks, Lucy. Molly, anything you want to add from that discussion?
Chair, just to highlight that the document was formally endorsed for board approval at this audit committee's meeting earlier, recognising again that there was an impact on reviewing our 3 lines of defence processes and also assessing the capacity of the internal audit team and our clinical audit infrastructure to allow us to have that assurance. So I just wanted to formally report the commitment to also have our own internal systems of assurance alongside these matters, which are deemed very significant, particularly the ones that relate to patient safety. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Molly. Okay, so are the board happy to accept the annual report and the annual governance statement, having regard to what's been said and the assurance requested and provided?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Molly, unless you tell me otherwise, that concludes the business of the meeting.
Yes, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you for your participation this afternoon. A variety of concerns and issues have been identified and responses detailed, which we will follow up outside of the meeting.